Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Gerald Horne. We wanted to interview him already for quite a while. He's a historian, writer, political activist, has written many amazing books, a whole list, so you can go to Google and check the whole list that he has written. Examples are the Counter-Revolution of 1776 and the Dawning of the Apocalypse, the Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. So that title really sums up what we also wish to talk about a bit about today. On Friday, we had the Dutch sociologist Jan Breeman, who is a professor in sociology at the University of Amsterdam. He talked about the roots of racism and white supremacy, Dutch colonialism starting in the 17th century. And today we talk a bit more about this topic with Dr. Gerald Horne. And I hope I'm allowed to start with a bit of a general question as the first question, Dr. Horne, and that is the following: we are now we're now on the anti-imperialist summit of RBN, and we would like to start a bit broad. What we really like about your work, as opposed to many of the mainstream historical accounts of Western history, is that you give white supremacy a prominent place in explaining the history of the US, Europe, and how that relates to imperialism and capitalism. Considering some of the most pressing issues plaguing our world today, think about wars, severe social inequality, climate change, etc. How would you connect these issues to the white supremacist, capitalist, and imperial roots of Europe and the United States? And if possible, any ideas on how we could resist this?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. That's a broad question, so I'll attack a piece of it, but in case my answer does not respond to every segment of your question, please come back with a follow-up. Now, I take it that you would like me to provide a kind of synthesis of my book on the 16th century. And this book on the 16th century has as a purpose seeking to understand how and why it is that London, which did not have the first mover's advantage post 1492, was able to surge from behind and ultimately overcome the Iberians, the Spanish and the Portuguese. And then, of course, with its revolting spawn, the United States of America, delivering the knockout blow to the tottering Spanish Empire in 1898. And I tackled this question, first of all, by trying to understand religion, which was a major axis of society, and to a certain degree still is, but certainly not to the degree that it was in 1492, that hinge year. Let's start with 1492, because that is the year in which the people we refer to as the Spanish were ultimately able to oust those they called Muslims from ruling the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, that rule had been declining for a number of decades, if not centuries, but the final knockout blow was delivered circa 1492. And of course, as you know, that's the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue as well. But there are other religious factors leading up to 1492, that is to say, the Inquisition, this process whereby the Catholics, or Catholic leaders, I should say, were fundamentally telling the Jewish population and other non-Catholic populations that you had to become a Catholic or be tortured or die or suffer some sort of penalty. Another factor leading up to 1492 is 1453, when the Islamic forces basically are able to seize what they eventually call Istanbul. Now, as I tell the story, when the monarchs in Iberia began to dispatch Columbus westward, it was in some ways seeking to escape the oncoming Islamic forces. And some historians would argue that it was a way to try to get to the riches of the East without confronting the Islamic forces if you sailed eastward and traveled eastward. This, as you know, leads to the initial genocide in the Americas after Columbus forces land. But then you have 1517 with the advent of Martin Luther and the secession from the Vatican, for reasons that it won't detain us here. But a few years later, these protesters, the Protestants as they call themselves, they are able to take London by storm. London wants to get in on the colonial feast, but of course, London is a scrappy underdog vis-a-vis the Catholics who see the London Protestants as not only a kind of mortal threat, but heretics and blasphemers on top of everything else. So to make a long story short, what happens is that in order to get in on the colonial feast, London diverges from the religious qualifications that the Spanish had imposed with regard to their settlements. That is to say, in the Spanish settlements, one could be an African and be a conquistador if one professed Catholicism. At the same time, of course, there's enslavement of Africans. I suggested either in that book or elsewhere that this sort of dichotomy between African conquistadors and African enslaved in some ways anticipates the 21st century in the United States, for example, with Black conquistadors and Black enslaved, which of course is funny. I don't know why I'm laughing. But in any case, London, the scrappy underdog, is not able to recruit as many Protestants to be settlers, even if they so chose. So like a jazz drummer in a club, they're improvising wildly. And of course, they move towards pan-Europeanism, that is to say, whiteness, then which morphs into white supremacy, which has its undergirding class collaboration. For if you look at settler colonialism in North America, it has been a class collaborationist project and has been a pan-European project. For example, Maryland, the US state of Maryland, on the border of Washington, D.C., was, quote, settled, unquote, by Catholics almost from the inception in the 17th century. Now, you would not have that sort of deal in the Spanish settlements. You could be a Protestant or a Jewish person in the Spanish settlement only if you passed as a Catholic. And in fact, as I suggest in the book, it is likely that a number of settlers in what is now New Mexico in the late 16th century were probably Jewish, passing as Catholics. And of course, there were examples of Protestants passing as Catholics as well. Whereas London somehow stumbled upon the winning ticket, which is basically pan-Europeanism. And this, of course, has misled many progressive people to this very day. That is to say, so many were taken with this idea of transcending or surpassing religious sectarianism, which admittedly is a step forward. They did not move to the second step, which is you transcended religious sectarianism by helping to devise a system that one could say perhaps is similarly noxious because it basically involves class collaboration, which we have not been able to overcome in North America to this very day. And it involves a white supremacy. And so what's happened over the centuries, of course, is that there has been a fierce fight back against this turn in history towards class collaboration and white supremacy. An initial victory was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. A victory in the 20th century was the rise of a socialist camp, which then assists national liberation movements, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, and Washington in particular, which inherits the mantle of leadership in the North Atlantic community from London in the 20th century, but then is, quote, saddled, unquote, with this large Black population, decides that the better part of wisdom is to make halting steps away from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy. But as a counterpoint to that, it decides to preemptively bash the communist forces, Black communist forces in particular, as a prelude to this halting retreat from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy, which then leaves the Black community in particular disadvantaged in confronting the new world that had been created. I should also make a footnote with regard to the Black community, which I think also has been misread and misinterpreted by many analysts. That is to say that the Black community in the United States is largely a product of a slave experience. It's largely a product of a horrific class experience. You're talking about a community that was enmeshed and immersed in class struggle almost from the time it stepped on these shores. And that did not predispose this Black population to engage in class collaboration, which has been an ethos of settler colonialism. So therefore, even mainstream historians have acknowledged that the Black population was not necessarily favorable to 1776, the overthrow of British rule led by the slave masters, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, in the vanguard. And when you fight a war and lose, as my ancestors did, you can expect to be penalized and pulverized forevermore until and unless you can turn the tables, which we began to do with our solidarity with the Haitian Revolution, and then solidarity with the rising socialist movement in the 20th century. But as noted, there was a kind of a decapitation of the Black left as a prelude into entering this new era of so-called desegregation. And so what's happened in this country, in the United States in particular, the leader of the capitalist world, is that some of the underlying tropes are hardly acknowledged today, although they're still manifested. I mean, for example, before we went live, we were talking about this front page story in the New York Times about Tucker Carlson and Fox News and how he plays upon racist fears in order to gin up an audience and gain popularity. Now, the article, and perhaps understandably, does not deal with how and why it is playing up racist fears strikes such a chord with a mass audience, mostly a mass Euro-American audience, by the way. I think in the article, it says that 90% plus of Tucker Carlson's audience is of European descent, or as London used to say, pure European descent. Now, I would argue that this bespeaks the roots of settler colonialism, whereby the European invaders, who were in the process of ousting the indigenous population, liquidating them en masse, had to fear retribution, which then generates racist fear because of the Native Americans striking back. And then fear of an apprehension about the presence of all these Africans who didn't want to work for free, who were not opposed to poisoning the so-called ruling race or strangling them in their beds at night. And so what's happened that's generated this underlying racist fear that it has yet to dissipate, and now has been turbocharged by this question of immigration from the South, particularly from Mexico. And I should mention, as I close out this long statement, that I have a book dropping in a few weeks on Texas, which secedes from Mexico in 1836 on the basis of Mexico moving to abolition under a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, by the way. That's part of the difference between settler colonialism in the Spanish-speaking part of this hemisphere and the Anglosphere. The United States had to wait 200 years after the election of Guerrero to welcome a president of African descent, speaking of Obama. And so the slave owners, led by Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, who, of course, rather ostentatiously then give their names to major cities, revolt and then carry out one of the most breathtaking genocides in the history of humanity, based in part upon the fact that the indigenous of Texas, for various reasons, were very good fighters, which meant that they had to endure a rather bloody retribution. I'm speaking of the Comanches, the Apaches, for example. In the introduction to this book, I list about 30 different indigenous ethnic groups that no longer exist in the state of Texas. And interestingly enough, that sort of genocide is oftentimes sort of taken for granted, believe it or not. You have people, I know people who live in California, they don't even know, they don't even think about the fact that you had a similar genocide in California. I mean, it's really breathtaking. And I'm talking about progressive people. I'm talking about people who consider themselves radical. The question of indigenous genocide hardly crosses their mind. And so, in part, I would suggest that when you can ignore genocide, you can ignore quite a bit. You can ignore climate change. I mean, you tend to take so much for granted. You tend to take white supremacy for granted as something that's supposedly eternal and will motor on indefinitely. But I would suggest that examining the roots of settler colonialism, particularly class collaboration and white supremacy, it's part of the key to unlocking how and why it is that the United States has become a kind of outlier with regard to tackling climate change, has been a genocidal force, a counter-revolutionary force, in fact, as the Cubans, the Grenadians, the Vietnamese, the Iranians, and nations and peoples too numerous to mention could well attest. But it all starts with this phenomenon of settler colonialism.
There are so many great things said here, and I'm going to pass it to Peter as well, but I definitely want to chime in here quickly, because you mentioned how people are ignoring genocide, and I've been calling out the crimes of the Biden administration, and you even mentioned the progressive voices, including the progressives who just approved sending weapons to Ukraine, but they're not calling out their president who is starving millions of Afghanistan citizens by stealing their funds, by withholding their funds. You have Biden sending weapons to Israel while they're ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people, while Israel is also bombing Syria. So also, I think that was very illuminating what you said. If people can ignore this stuff, what else are they willing to ignore? That creates a horrific pathology for them. And now I also want get your opinion on this, because I cover and I criticize harshly the people I call Negro imperialists. That's the term that Fred Hampton used. So if you don't have education, you don't have Negro capitalists, you're gonna have Negro imperialists. And they have essentially taken over the black establishment, that you will. When I look at my revolutionary leaders, when you look at Malcolm X, when you look at MLK, who was attacked harshly by white liberals and establishment by having an anti-militarism philosophy, somehow we went to to people like John Lewis being held as heroes, even though he essentially gave Barack Obama authorization to destroy Libya. So in a very broad way, I would love for you to speak on that. Like, how did the black bourgeoisie, or maybe it always been captured, you can make that argument as well, by imperialist forces? You also can add to this as well, if you want to, like, why is it so important for black people, colonized people, to still resist imperialism, be knowledgeable about imperialism? Because as a black network, that's one of our main focuses, which is why we're hosting this anti-imperialist summit. Do you want to speak on that, Joe, Dr. Horne? You can take that any way you want.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I've suggested, I don't think I've written about it, but I've certainly said it in interviews, that the way the United States is going right now, with this upsurge in militarism, for example, and the fear and hostility towards China, because the ruling class, they'd spent trillions on the Cold War, and the idea was that somehow this would lead to U.S. domination über alles, forevermore. And yet you have all of these books being churned out about the so-called Chinese threat. And so this is leading to a certain kind of hysteria. The subtitle of my book on Texas, the title of the book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. That is to say that I've oftentimes suggested that for the Black community, which will inevitably be an early, and is an early, victim of proto-fascism, because you can make an argument that for decades now, what's been playing out in the United States is a kind of proto-fascism directed towards the Black community, and a kind of bourgeois democracy directed towards other communities. That is to say, with regard to the death penalty, where Black people were disproportionately cited, with regard to police killings, we all know the story, the sad and sorry litany. This is execution without due process of law. You saw the recent story in Grand Rapids, Michigan, of Patrick Loyoya, the Congolese migrant who shot in the back of the head by a police officer, execution without the process of law. Interestingly enough, his lawyer, Benjamin Crump, who is no radical, said at a recent press conference, he wondered why people could shed crocodile tears about what's happening in Ukraine and pass over blissfully, blithely, unknowingly about what's taking place in the streets of the United States of America, not Grand Rapids, not least. Now, with regard to the Black community, as noted, the community has been handcuffed because U.S. imperialism, as noted, with the move towards desegregation in the 1950s, decided to decapitate the Black radical leadership. And then, of course, like a seesaw, when you decapitate that section of the leadership, another section of the leadership tends to rise. And in any case, there were preconditions that would allow for this other leadership to rise, what you refer to rather bluntly as the Negro imperialists. If you look at the current issue of The Nation, the New York-based left-leaning weekly, I have a review essay about W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which I give the book its props. I mean, it was a step forward with regard to the United States in terms of trying to understand the Civil War in part as being a magnificent story of class struggle by formerly enslaved Africans. That is to say, when they entered the war in the tens of thousands, 1861 to 1865, it turned the tables against the slave owners who were trying to overthrow the United States government in order to perpetuate slavery forevermore. However, Du Bois and most Black leaders since then, including Frederick Douglass, who has received quite a bit of attention as a Black leader, they hardly ever engaged the indigenous question. And so you have the spectacle of Black people in Texas, for example, as I point out in my upcoming book, being lynched and subjected to marauding by racist terrorists in East Texas, where you have Black soldiers in West Texas, per the Buffalo Soldiers, who you may know from the Bob Marley song, spearing the indigenous population, the Apaches and the Comanches in particular. So obviously this is a contradiction. I mean, how do you suffer being lynched in one part of the state and being the lynchers in the other part of the state? And once again, this goes back to this fatal flaw, what I see as a fatal flaw amongst many in the progressive movement who do not really engage the indigenous question. I mean, it's almost as if they take a very hard-boiled and cynical look, where they say, well, liquidation of the indigenous population has led to a great leap forward for capitalism, which then lays the foundation for socialism. So, life is hard, life is tough. Well, I guess that's easy to say if you're not indigenous, to take such a bloodthirsty, hard-boiled look. And I think they did the same thing with regard to Black people as well, which is that, well, slavery advanced the productive forces of society, which then lays the basis for capitalism, which then lays the basis for socialism. So, that's life. Life is hard. Life is tough. And fortunately, that kind of cynicism, and that's probably too euphemistic a term to use, is dissipating as we encounter what might very well be the next stage of U.S. imperialism, which is full-blown fascism across the board, not just a sort of proto-fascism directed against a segment of the population. And this leads me to my other point, which is I think that the right wing is so strong and so formidable in this country because it has a mass base. It has a base, obviously, in the ruling class, but it has a base in the middle class. It has a base in the working class. The attempted coup of January 6, 2021, and pay attention in particular to the recent speeches of Congressman Raskin of Maryland about January 6th. And of course, the hearings will be launched next month. He has suggested in some of his recent statements that the slogan of the Marauders on January 6th, "Hang Mike Pence," was coming from the top, that they were willing to liquidate the vice president since he was not willing to go along with the bollocksing of the Electoral College vote. Now that's a bit too abstruse to go into in detail, but he says that when Pence, the vice president, refuses to get into his limousine to leave the Capitol on January 6th, it's because he fears that his own security is in cahoots with the coup plotters, and they're going to take him away from the Capitol for whatever reason. Now, if you put that in a Hollywood screenplay, you probably couldn't peddle it. But this, and then I would also say as well, and I gave a lecture at the University of Illinois in Chicago that you can find on their website sooner rather than later, where I point out that there's this counter-revolutionary impulse that's inherent in settler colonialism that has worked itself out over the decades and over the centuries up to and including January 6th, And the way things are going now, we have yet to endure the final chapter. Now, with regard to Ukraine, the only point I would say about that is that when I go on Black radio, which I do quite a bit, many of the listeners, they want to talk about how Biden plans to leapfrog 100,000 Ukrainians to the front of the immigration line, where Haitians are being roughhoused and manhandled on the Texas-Mexico border. They talk about how African students escaping Ukraine are being subjected to bigotry in the US ally, that is Poland. That's what they want to talk about. But I don't necessarily hear that coming from what the late Glenn Ford used to call the Negro misleadership class. And I think it's in part, not only because of ideological weakness, but in part because the right wing is so strong. It's so intimidating. I mean, you know, they'll liquidate you like they're throwing dandruff off their shoulder. And so it's, you know, as I said, Congressman Raskin said they were willing to liquidate the vice president. So that helps to keep everybody in line, basically, in the land of the free and the home of the brave where democracy reigns.
I just have a follow-up question to Nick's question, which is a little more broadly, like, what do you make of the state of leftists in the West? Specifically, like, their ignorance of imperialism, or their lack of focus on imperialism, and a seemingly exclusive focus on other issues that, you know, don't rise to the level from an international perspective. Like in China, they made a word for this. They call them Baizoa, like white leftists. Like, you don't have to be unmelanated, but you just have to completely ignore economics, completely ignore imperialism, and focus exclusively on just objectively less important issues, whatever they are. So, like, how do you explain that? Like, is it the historical result of so much state repression in the past? Is it intellectual fads from Europe over the past like half century? How do you make sense of that?
Well, I think in part you put your finger on it in terms of state repression, which at once it liquidates previous radicals. I think of Paul Robeson, who I wrote a biography of, the tallest tree in our forests, multilingual, activist, actor, but refused to go along with the Red Scare and the Cold War as income falls from the 6 figures to the low 4 figures. And as was oftentimes said during the times of slavery, you only need to beat one slave to keep the entire plantation in line. And so people ingest and imbibe the lesson that the better part of wisdom is to sort of go with the flow, even if you are a kind of radical. Because, as I said, these folks in this country, they play for keeps. And then I think in part, it stems from fundamental misreading of 1776. That is to say, folks think they're living in a revolutionary country, believe it or not. And if you believe that, then it makes it easier to ignore the indigenous question, to ignore genocide. And if you can, as I said, you can ignore genocide, that puts you on the path to ignoring just about everything. And then it leads to a misreading of what used to be called the Negro question, which fundamentally, as I said, is a class question. You're talking about a class of unpaid workers who are treated horrifically, who engage in class struggle. But from the point of view of many of our friends on the left, at least in the United States, they don't see that as a class question. They see it as an identity question. You know, that this is identity politics. And then at the same time, whiteness, which is this fabricated identity, basically, that arises with the rise of settler colonialism. That's not an identity question. That's sort of, it's like the air we breathe. I mean, it's sort of taken for granted, even though it's a monetized and militarized identity, quite frankly. And so I could go on at length reciting the sins and transgressions of many of our friends on the left. I'm doing a project right now on the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. The Black Panther Party, for those who may not be familiar, arose in the 1960s. It was sort of a halfway house between Marxism and Black nationalism, the Black nationalism of Malcolm X, for example. And they quickly attained a reputation for bruising confrontations with the state. I think you mentioned Fred Hampton, for example, who, as you know, was killed in his bed December 4th, 1969 by the state authorities, recently the subject of a film, Judas and the Black Messiah. And that was not unusual. The leader of the secret police, J. Edgar Hoover, said that they were the most mortal threat to U.S. security. But unfortunately, one of the points that I've discovered is that many people who I respect did not really understand the Black Panther Party. And I think it's because they had a misreading of the United States. They had a misreading of the United States as being this bourgeois democratic experiment, and which arises from a legitimate revolution. And I think that then that leads the Black Panther Party to sort of accept what they're saying, and then to say, okay, let's move to the next stage, which is socialism. I mean, if these folks who we respect, or who we had respected, or are accurate, but of course, what happens, these folks that they had respected, other Marxists, were at the same time very critical of the Black Panther Party for ultra-leftism, for adventurism, for prematurely picking up the gun, etc. Although I think that to the extent that those criticisms were true, it was stemming from the Black Panthers basically listening to these people's analysis of US history. Therein lies a cruel dilemma.
Yeah, the problem that we have now, I want to pass it to Kareem next. And we criticize the U.S. left all the time due to what we see as lack of revolutionary discipline. And we're talking about a lot of issues today on the Anti-Imperialist Summit. We're talking about internationalism. And these are things that they seem to have abandoned. They seem to have forget the fact that we are fighting against these giant intelligence communities that infiltrate our movement. And that's something that we had to be aware of, because the Black Panther movement was infiltrated by intelligence communities, as we know. So if we are moving as a left, and we're not discussing these things, we're not discussing imperialism, if we're not discussing how to resist state violence instead of enabling it. Like, once again, I still can't believe I read this morning that the progressives went along with the Democratic Party and they voted to give more weapons to the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But you see, this is the revolutionary indiscipline that you see out of them, which ultimately leads them to selling out our communities, because a lot of people who are in charge of the white left and the strategies that they use they come from the white bourgeoisie class, or they are captured by Black and brown and colonized people who rather join their oppressors, which has been a trend that many Black writers, W.B. Du Bois, called out. Hell, you even had Colin Powell that said the quiet part out loud, that if you're Black, brown, if you're colonized, the best thing you can do to achieve prosperity and escape racism is joining the military or the police. And what does that say about our society, that if you're Black and colonized, the best route that you have is to join the colonizer? Right. So I don't want to get on too much of the tangent. You can speak on that. Also want to get Kareem protection here if you have a question as well. Check your audio, Kareem. Check your audio.
Oh yeah, no, I was just saying many interesting things, and many things I actually wanted to touch on. Let me first ask this question. It's a bit of a sociological question, but I just wonder if you have any kind of idea about this or an opinion on this. Because on the left, we see in the US, but also in Europe, we see a kind of divide. On the one hand, we have people, and they are popularly called so-called class reductionists, those who hold on to the idea that class is more important more determinant, you could say, of one's life outcomes than race. And then you have other people who say, well, wait a minute, we should not put class at the center of leftism, but it's actually race. So they are called race reductionists who focus on the fact that race determines more strongly one's social status within our society, and therefore race is more important than class. So you have a bit of that back and forth in the left scene, and you would see that the class reductionists, so to speak, are majority white most often. That's something that I notice, and race reductionists, that's a bit more diverse. I always say these two are or they are related, but they are two separate constructs that interact with each other, I would say. But I'm just curious, what is your view on the relative importance of both of these constructs in our society today? Bit of a sociological question, but I suspect you have an idea.
Well, if there's a transcript, just scroll down to my comment from a few moments ago, where I pointed out that what's called a race question is basically a class question. I mean, it's not as if our ancestors were dragged across the Atlantic simply because people didn't like us, or they had a revulsion to melanin. It was an opportunity to exploit free labor. And when we talk in the United States today about the Black community in the United States voting 9-1 against the right wing, of course, because of the strength of the right wing and the manipulation of election laws, oftentimes you're only given two choices in terms of voting. And the Black community is the demographic that votes most heavily against the right wing, 9-1, 8-2. Now, I would argue that this is a legacy. It's a legacy of class exploitation of slavery, and an ongoing reflection of the fact that this community is heavily working class, selling its labor, and oftentimes being more pro-labor or pro-union than any other sectors of the demographic. This recent heralded victory of workers organizing at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, it's no accident that it's led by a Black worker, interestingly enough, who admitted to using as a playbook the book published decades ago by William Z. Foster on the steel strike. William Z. Foster, of course, being an early leader of communist forces in the United States of America. I don't know how to interpret the fact that hasn't gotten more publicity. I'm watching very carefully, though, because this country, as I said, this country is so right wing. You never know what to expect. So in sum and in short, I find this debate between so-called class reductionists and race reductionists, in a certain sense, missing the point, since what they refer to, the class forces don't apparently see that those they call race are actually those who are still reeling from the legacy of class exploitation infused with white supremacy and racism. That is to say, the Black community. And of course, the so-called race reductionists, I would hope that they realize that the Black community, of course, was brought here to be an exploited class. And so how and why that simple point is not gathered, I have to say, baffles and befuddles me. And with regard to the point that was made about Colin Powell, one data point that you should add is that it is not coincidental that the first Black mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, was a former police officer. The second Black mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, a former captain in the New York City police. Oftentimes the ruling elite and their so-called white enablers, they like, they're going to cede, oftentimes ascribe these rules in the United States to an 18th century army. They advance, and then you push them back some, and then they dig in. And then they advance, and you push them back, and they dig in. So they would not necessarily want to have any sort of Black leadership for whatever reason, because they think that the community is untrustworthy because of our role in allying with the real and imagined foes of settler colonialism over the centuries. However, if they're going to have a Black leader, they prefer to have a Black police officer or a Black soldier like Colin Powell, for example. I mean, that's the compromise position.
I want to add this because I think it's almost a concerted effort to get people to separate race and class for whatever reason. Obviously, you got white supremacists don't want people to talk about race. You got the capitalists don't want people to talk about class. And when I live my life experience, when I read the history of our people, when I see the state extracting wealth from our communities via civil asset forfeiture, regressive fines and fees, the fact that we got to pay higher rates on homes and loans in general. But I also want to add this point because of this. This is why Black people tend to be more class conscious. Now, to back up Dr. Gerald Horne's point, I'm gonna share you guys some numbers that you will never hear from the mainstream. From the mainstream media and the corporate media, they will have you believe that you cannot sell socialism, you cannot sell anti-capitalism to the Black community because the Black community is inherently conservative. Now, there is some truth into the social conservatism of a lot of Black people, especially in the Bible Belt where I live, right? But now let me show you guys this to back up the point that our amazing guest has been making. I covered this story. A lot of people did not. So the overall headline, talking about how America is continuing to move towards socialism. They're willing to talk about this, but whenever they talk about this, they will say, oh, it's just a young people, a ton of white, you hear this all the time, it's white leftists that are pushing our populace too far to the left and Black community. They're not having it. The Black community don't want to defund the police, even though we always been the most popular demographic for that. Black people are not for socialism, even though, as I'm about to explain to you, you see what I highlighted here? The highest group, socialism has a positive connotation for 60%, 6 out of 10 Black Americans, which is the highest out any demographic that they asked. So that kind of back up what Gerald was saying. Also want to kind of slightly shift gears here because I want to ask you something that's kind of relevant as well, because we've been covering the Russia-Ukraine war. I would love to get your thoughts on that. But I read the Black radical position on NATO that came from the Black Alliance for Peace. And when you look at NATO as imperialist global power, it's been used to pretty much uphold white power and settler colonialism. So I would love to get your general takes on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. What a lot of people missing regarding that, and what do you think like the Black radical position should be on, like NATO, for example? If you want to take that, Dr. Horne.
Well, first of all, I wrote a piece days after the conflict erupted in the Black Agenda Report website, blackagendareport.com. And I've given a number of talks about it since then, some of which on Black Agenda Report, some of which can be found on various Facebook sites as well. This is a message I would like to see the left this is not my prime message, but this is my latest message that I would like to see the left use. This is my advice in soft voice to the U.S. ruling class, which is that Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin just announced a few days ago that a purpose of the U.S. Arming Zelensky's forces is to weaken Russia. Now, my message to the U.S. ruling elite is this, that before this conflict erupted, we were told, per Obama and others, that the United States was involved in a pivot towards Asia, that China is the big enchilada, China is the ball game, and that therefore you have, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, I mean, you have the de facto admittance of Japan into the Five Eyes alliance, of the intelligence sharing alliance of US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. I mean, I could go on and on in this vein. And so my point to the US ruling class is that you think that you're bogging down, that you're weakening Russia. But if China is the ultimate ball game, what are you doing being bogged down in Central and Eastern Europe? Don't you think that perhaps your cadre have been infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party that wants you to be bogged down in Central and Eastern Europe so that you can't focus on China? You really need to think about that. But seriously, folks, in the Black Agenda Report column that I wrote, and I have to say I'm surprised that it hasn't received more attention, even on the left, is that there has been a basic disconnect in the history of Europe. Insofar as, to go back to my first point, as the Western Europeans were getting fat off the plunder and pillage of Africa and the Americas, they still were not necessarily the leading force in their own backyard, speaking of the European continent. That is to say that most of, as we all know now, most of Europe's natural resources are in Russia: petroleum, gold, palladium, titanium. And by the way, Boeing is having problems now constructing its jets because of this boycott on titanium. And so what happens historically is that Napoleon 200 years ago, and actually the Swedes before that, then under Peter, during the reign of Peter the Great, they tried to deal with this contradiction by invading Russia, and of course they're defeated. And then a few decades later, you have the Crimea War with London and Paris, with the then sick man of Europe, Ottoman Turkey, ganging up on Russia. Then, in a real turning point in world history, 1904 to 1905, you have London basically using a rising Japan as a proxy to attack Russia, which leads not only to 1905, the precursor of 1917, but you could make an argument directly to 1917. And of course, Japan repays the favor to London by then ousting London from Hong Kong and Singapore and a good deal of Asia, 1941, 1942. And of course, then Hitler then tries to square the circle by June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, trying to take over Russia. And then in the pièce de résistance, this is one of the reasons I came to Hong Kong, is 1971, 1972. It's quite ironic that we were marking the 50th anniversary of the Nixon trip to China just before February 24th, 2022, when the United States makes the deal with China on an anti-Soviet basis. In return, China gets massive direct foreign investment, creating this juggernaut, which now the United States is trying to bring to heel. But once again, they're bogged down confronting Russia. And so the analogy, I use this popular US novel, Moby Dick, whereby the protagonist is driven a bit batty and daffy by seeking to harpoon the great white whale. And so if you look at Russia on the map, it sort of resembled a great whale, and it's sort of driving the North Atlantic powers daffy as they seek to harpoon it. And so they're going to run the risk of getting bogged down in Russia. Although, of course, their calculation is that if they can overthrow the regime in Moscow, this will fortify them and bulk them up sufficiently that they'll be prepared to take on the big enchilada, speaking of the People's Republic of China. And I've lived long enough not to take anything for granted, although right now that seems like a dim prospect. But, I've been wrong before, so we shall see.
I want to get Peter in here. Peter or Cream, you guys want to follow up with anything?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask a question that was more related to the topic you were just discussing. But the next question I had was either about communist history in the United States, or a much broader question, kind of returning to the one that Kareem asked at the very beginning. I guess maybe that would be the best. So there are many different, like causal forces behind imperialism. You could say greed, racism, lust for power. You mentioned religion. What do you think the relative roles of these and like the causal import of these were as European imperialism evolved from the beginning into modern day U.S. imperialism?
Well, in terms of modern day U.S. imperialism, I would, of course, go back to Lenin and Hobson with regard to the export of capital. That is to say, you see this particular with regard to North America, whereby North America was basically a prison house of nations. And you had the overthrow of indigenous polities. I've mentioned the Comanches, for example. Of course, I could have mentioned the Cherokees and scores of others. And then with the capstone being the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom in the 1890s, which was a modern kingdom. I mean, in some ways, it was more modern than the U.S. mainland. And if it tried to effectuate an alliance with a rising Japan. That's one of the reasons why a plurality of the population of the Hawaiian archipelago to this very day is of Japanese ancestry, but that does not save them. And then from the Hawaiian kingdom to Philippines, Cuba, Guam, etc. And then working in tandem with the British Empire. For example, in my book on Kenya, I point out that with regard to that settler colonial regime in East Africa, that some of the key operatives were actually Euro-Americans, because Britain has this problem of having a contemporary population of only about 60, 65 million, yet trying to control this sprawling empire that includes the jewel, which is India, contemporary population of 1.3 billion. So oftentimes they had to rely heavily upon the pan-European enterprise that was the United States of America. And so I would say that return on investment, greed, however you want to characterize it, that's the driving force for imperialism. But of course, there are other aspects as well. In one, I think it was in the book on Zimbabwe, I pointed out that imperialism not only involves the export of capital, it involves the export of a often violent libido, for example. And indeed, after doing this Texas book, one of the points that I should have stressed more, it's probably too, but it's definitely in the pages, but I should have highlighted it more, is that one of the things that struck me was what I call prevaricated marriages. That is to say, the settlers would engage in these phony marriages with indigenous women so they could get a leg up in terms of gaining access to the land, for example. They did the same thing with Mexican women, for example, in the Southwest. We really need more. I mean, the evidence is all over the place. And I should have stressed it more. But in any case, so those are some of my preliminary observations with regard to imperialism.
Yeah, so if I can ask you quickly a bit of a question that I had about the ideology of white supremacy, which is a bit of an obsession of mine. And so I come from the Netherlands. I read a lot about Dutch colonialism in the 17th century. And we, like I said, we just interviewed a professor who focused on that and also focused on the idea of white supremacy as a driving force behind Dutch colonialism. And when I listen to you and also when I read some of your work, I notice that you seem to often see white supremacy as almost a unique kind of United States thing. When the different Europeans came on the shore of the United States, they suddenly threw off their identity and all became white, so to speak. But when you read the really old kind of how can I say that books, writings of Dutch colonialism, 16th, 17th century, that was hyper white supremacist. So that seemed to be divine rights, inferior beings, all that kind of talk. So it seemed to be a serious problem all over Europe, of all the European colonial powers, so to speak. And I see it, and I still see it today. I think white supremacy is a severe problem in my society, and other societies like Belgium and France. And so I was wondering, do you see a really a qualitative difference between maybe Anglo-Saxon kind of white supremacy versus the other European colonial powers, or would you say they're all the same? They're just a few little, insignificant differences, so to speak. Difficult question, but I'm just interested what you think about this.
Well, I would say the United States has been in the vanguard in terms of incorporating various pan-European groupings into this overarching category of whiteness. You see this from the beginning in the 1580s, when there's the abortive attempt to establish a settlement in what is now North Carolina. There were not just Englishmen, for example. London had this long-term alliance with Portugal, so there were Portuguese, for example. So I would say that perhaps because those who emerged triumphant in what they call their homeland, speaking of North America, from its inception had incorporated various European ethnicities, perhaps you could apprise me as to whether or not the Netherlands, for example, on its own homeland, from its inception, had been incorporating various European ethnicities. Now, I will say this, however, that what has distinguished some of the so-called winners in terms of who is going to prevail at the colonial feast has been their attempt precisely to incorporate other European. I mean, for example, it's well known, as I talk about in my book, that London had expelled its Jewish population in the 13th century, but by the 16th century, being a scrappy underdog and being under the gun, it begins to incorporate the Jewish population fleeing Iberia, ditto for Amsterdam, for example. And despite bumpiness alongst the way, that is to say, anti-Semitism still rearing its head, U.S. imperialism probably has done a better job than French imperialism in terms of incorporating a Jewish population, for example. I mean, it would be difficult, not impossible, for reasons I will suggest in a moment, but it would be difficult as of today to have a Madame Le Pen be as popular in France, to be as similarly popular in the United States. Now, I think that's about to go through a transition because I think that the United States is going to pay a heavy price for bashing left-wing communists and radical forces, and like a seesaw, that's going to lead to the rise of what you already see is white Christian nationalism, which does not bode well for the Jewish American community. It does not bode well for the Muslim community as well. But having said that, I would say in answer to your question that I see many parallels between and amongst the United States and its North Atlantic allies and neighbors, sometimes competitors. But with regard to the United States, I think that there are reasons of why, as of today, it's top dog in the North Atlantic community. One, in the sense that I think vis-a-vis France, it did a better job, and certainly vis-a-vis Spain, it did a better job in incorporating the Jewish community, for example. And then secondly, I think that in its own so-called homeland, speaking of North America, that it had fierce battles to endure, which necessitated recruiting every warm body you could find, which then makes this whiteness category even more elastic. For example, I mean, in Galveston, Texas, as early as the mid-19th century, you had Jewish leadership. one of the first Jewish senators elected in the United States was David Yulee of Florida in 1845. Of course, he was a slave owner, producing sugar in Florida, had a 5,100 acre plantation, for example. Roots in North Africa, interestingly enough, which ties into another topic I'll be delving into shortly, which is that I mentioned bumpiness along the way in terms of incorporating this Jewish community in the United States. The Jewish elite likes to talk about this letter that George Washington sent to the Jewish community in the 1790s, sort of welcoming them into the bosom of the newly Christian republic. They talk less about the fact that during that same time and shortly thereafter, the US leaders were accusing North African Jewish communities of being complicit in terms of kidnapping US sailors, enslaving them, and even selling them on to the slave markets of Turkey, which then helps to undergird the Marine hymn, US Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, because of course they were battling these forces in North Africa before there was a kind of accommodation, which arises roughly by 1830 with the French takeover of Algeria. So in some, I see parallels with regard to the United States and its North Atlantic comrades in terms of this whiteness project, but also significant differences based upon the battles in the so-called homeland, fighting which the Europeans, I mean, you know, African slavery was a thing in Western Europe, but certainly not to the same extent that it was in North America, making it less of a fearsome problem, for example, and battling Comanches and Cherokees and Choctaw and Creek and Seminoles and Iroquois and the hundreds of other indigenous polities makes the United States virtually unique and gives this whiteness project a unique character. But in any case, it seems like it's 8 minutes after 10, and I know you all have other guests, so I don't want to hog the microphone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we appreciate your time. I want to give you an opportunity to get final thoughts, and also you can promote anything you wish.
I think I've done enough of that already.
we always want to give one last opportunity to show appreciation. So I want to give you a chance to share any final thoughts. And once again, I do appreciate you coming on, and I learned a lot from your work as well. So it was an honor having this conversation. So any last thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Yeah, moving on. I'm sure after I hang up, I'll think of all sorts of things. But that's the way this usually works. But I can't think of anything right now. I think I've done enough promoting, self-promotion, probably to excess. And only to thank you, and I wish you well.
Absolutely.
And, keep me posted.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you a favor before you go? Just a bit of knowledge. I don't know if you know, if you follow this, probably nobody knows or cares, but the Washington American football team used to have an ethnic slur as its name. Right. Now it's the Washington Commanders. Right. And so people immediately started joking like, oh, it's the Washington Commies. Right. And that reminded me, I thought, I know so few American communists, like, Paul Robeson, you mentioned before, but could you share just like a really short introduction to American communists or Afro-American communists that most people have not heard of that you think people would benefit from learning about? Yeah, well, some of them I've written books about. Well, this ties into your point, more self-promotion. But I wrote a book about William Patterson, who was trained at the party school in Moscow and spoke Russian, Black American, born in San Francisco circa 1890, dies in New York circa 1980. He leads the Scottsboro campaign in the 1930s, which is an international campaign, not unlike the anti-apartheid movement, international campaign against U.S. Jim Crow, which is a signal factor in pushing back
U.S. Jim Crow, and joins hands with Paul Robeson, who he influences to the left when Paul Robeson was sort of wondering ideologically, to join with him to file a petition at the United Nations circa 1950, 1951, charging the United States with genocide against Black people, gets tremendous international publicity. And of course, it leads to a jail term for William Patterson. And then in the latter stages of his life, he's counseling the Black Panthers. That's what I was sort of obliquely referring to a few moments ago. And then is a factor in the Angela Davis campaign, when the UCLA professor is charged with being complicit in a shootout in 1970 in Marin County, California, that leads to the death of a judge and a number of others. And that leads to another worldwide campaign. So William Patterson, Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, founder of Pan-Africanism, who I've written about, joins the Communist Party at the age of 93, just before he takes exile in Ghana, West Africa, where he dies in 1963. His spouse, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who is given credit or discredit, depending on your point of view, of helping to influence him to join the Communist Party, because she had been a member of the U.S. Communist Party, a novelist, playwright, becomes a big-time Maoist, by the way. She dies in China, indeed, in 1977. Ferdinand Smith, a Black trade union leader with roots in Jamaica, helps to organize the National Maritime Union, one of the most powerful unions of that era. And that leads to his being deported back to his native Jamaica, where he becomes a leader of the independence movement, culminating in independence and sovereignty in 1962 in Jamaica. So I think that the U.S. ruling class had its hands full. I'm just talking about Black communists. I could speak about others if we had the time. It had its hands full. Just like I think that during the heyday of the British Empire, London had its hands full dealing with British communists. I think Rajani Palm Dutt, D-U-T-T, for example. As a matter of fact, when I was in my youth, we used to read the British communists quite a bit. Maurice Cornforth, for example, that used to be the foundation of our study groups. His 3-volume study, Historical Materialism, Dialectical Materialism, and the Theory of Knowledge. I still recommend it to young people. So I don't think it's accidental that these empires almost effortlessly develop the polar opposite, that is to say. It seems to go with the territory, which actually makes me a little off the record. I'll have to deny having said this if it's repeated. It makes me a little pessimistic about today, because I don't see that kind of ideological sagacity today that I saw in previous decades. But perhaps I'm missing something. Let's be optimistic.
Well said. Well said. So we have like another 15 minutes, but no rush. I don't want to keep you any longer than you have planned. Our next, I don't know what your plans are, Peter and Kareem. I'm still waiting to hear from them. I'm kind of hoping that we confirmed for 10:30 we're gonna have the Palestinian Action Community with us, and we're gonna talk about Israel, Palestine, and Peter and Kareem. You guys are obviously welcome to stay as long as you guys want, because I know you guys are really good on that issue as well. So yeah, I've read your piece in the Black Agenda Report, Dr. Horne. Is there any final questions that Kareem, Peter had? Any final thoughts? Because we still have time, so there's no rush. But obviously, I want to be respectful of your time as well. I want to pass it to Kareem. Any other questions that you guys have?
Well, my questions are always too broad and too big, and they always ask for very long answers. So I'm going to leave it to Peter, maybe.
Actually, since we have the Israel-Palestine panel coming next, and now we're doing a little extra credit, we appreciate you staying a little bit longer with the Dr. Horne. What's your general synopsis of the Israel-Palestine situation? Why is the West able to get away with arming this apartheid state while pretending to support like the freedom fight of the Ukrainian people? And I also want to add, I can add this part too, since I'm coming up with this question on the fly. You see people cheering for Ukrainian people and their right to self-defense, but then they will call Palestinians terrorists for even throwing rocks at them. So any general thoughts on that, Gerald Horne, we wrap this up?
Well, just a few points. One is a cautionary note. I'm sure your audience would not be seduced into believing that the ability to rapidly generate a BDS movement against Russia, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, would serve as a kind of precedent that would give momentum necessarily and unavoidably to a BDS movement against Israel. There's no necessary connection because we know that the North Atlantic Bloc, their leaders and many of those who they represent are past masters at hypocrisy and double standards and doublespeak. And so, having said that, however, I do wonder if Washington is playing with fire with regard to broaching the question of international criminal court prosecutions against Russia. Now, we know, per the Hague Invasion Act some years ago, that the United States has actually threatened to invade your homeland, sir, if the International Criminal Court would be so audacious as to open files with regard to U.S. leaders. And we also know that the U.S. Sought to sanction the ICC prosecutor, including her family members, for example. And yet now they're talking about opening the door to ICC prosecutions of Russia. So once again, my message to the U.S. ruling class, if any are tuned in, is to proceed very carefully and cautiously, because you could be opening Pandora's box. I would also say that just as a minor data point, this is in terms of our previous discussion with regard to Black history, that a turning point in the struggle for historic Palestine comes with the ultra-Zionist assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish diplomat dispatched by the United Nations. And of course, after he is killed, his deputy takes over, Ralph Bunche, a Black American, a former leftist, teaching at Howard University, the Black American University in Washington, D.C. But like so many, he puts his finger to the wind and makes a determination that the left is going to be isolated and marginalized. And so then he becomes a key figure in this one-sided deal that leads to the creation of Israel and helps to create what's oftentimes referred to as the Palestine refugee problem. It reminds me of what I was talking about a moment ago in terms of the Buffalo Soldiers. It's one of those chapters in, even though it's just one individual, but still, I mean, he wins the Nobel Prize. He's lauded and lionized, not only by Black Americans, although the late poet Amiri Baraka had as one of his more famous lines, when we were being touted to follow the example of Ralph Bunche, Amiri said, well, you can't eat Ralph Bunche for lunch. And so why should we follow him? So I would also say that with regard to this Israel-Palestine question, there's one more point that I'm trying to think of. Oh yeah, the Security Council, which is that the hotheads in Washington, they now want to reformulate the United Nations Security Council, somehow get rid of Russia, for example. And I caution them to be careful, because that may open the door to permanent membership for India, Brazil, South Africa. Speaking of which, I would ask many of our friends on the left to stop looking at the Ukraine crisis with tunnel vision. That is to say, Washington, Kiev, Moscow, and to look at the wider implications, for example, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, because you really, come on, you can't do an accurate and adequate analysis through tunnel vision. Almost by definition. I would also caution the Israeli lobby in the United States, which is quite influential, shall we say, that there are those who are watching these Israeli votes and the Israeli ties to Russia very carefully. For example, there are those who've taken note of the point that Israel, like many countries worldwide, is now hedging, and there have been credible allegations that Israel has leaked sophisticated U.S. military technology to China, for example. We know about Israel's relationship to Moscow. Benjamin Netanyahu used to stand shoulder to shoulder with Vladimir Putin on May 9th, which is coming up soon, the most important day on the Russian military calendar, or Russian calendar, I should say, the Victory in Europe Day. So in certain ruling circles in the United States, there's a certain edginess about Israel is now emerging. And so I would caution the Israeli ruling elite not to overplay its hand, particularly in the light of the rise of this white Christian nationalism, which I've made reference to. You should not assume that what obtained yesterday will obtain tomorrow and forevermore. So I understand that's why you're hedging with regard to China, but you need to realize that there's a downside to that hedge play.
If we have just like 5 more minutes or so, this is kind of a silly question, but your top 5 revolutions, what would those?
You sound like Chris Rock.
Yeah.
You see that movie Top 5?
Well, you could answer top 5 left-wing rappers, but revolution.
Well, I have to say I have a soft spot for the Cuban Revolution, and I have a soft spot for the Haitian Revolution. Perhaps because those are our neighbors. Perhaps because they had so much impact on my life and the life of many of my comrades. Of course, Russian Revolution. I would be remiss. Let's say top 3, unless I can think of 2 others. Yeah,
Chinese.
Well, sure, but I've had a complex relationship. If you go back and look at what I've been writing, it's interesting. Today, 2022, I'm accused of being in the tank for Beijing, which is ironic, since if you look at what I've said over the decades, particularly after the Nixon trip, 1972, I was very critical. If you look at my book on Southern Africa, for example, which I doubt will be translated into Putonghua, I'm very critical of Chinese policy in Southern Africa. However, it looks like we'll see what happens, but it seems as if China has U.S. imperialism in the North Atlantic countries bogged down in Central and Eastern Europe. So it looks like things are going their way. So we'll see. We'll see.
Well said. So we have scheduled another panel in about 5 minutes. Still waiting to hear from them. Hopefully they just kind of pop in last second. So generally, once again, our conversation was going to be about. I guess I'm warming our audience up while we wait from regarding Israel Palestine. They want to talk about Israel's relationship and their position as a colonial state in power, and they have plenty of criticisms of what they deem as disloyal U.S. leftists. And we talk about this, Kareem and Peter. There's like this thing in the West where you're a progressive, accept Palestine. And actually, since we have a little extra time, I plan on covering this. Let's see if I can find this. So maybe I'll go to this part later because I don't got this prepared. But Jamal Bowman has pretty much voted just like Elliot Engel. The most recent example, a lot of people who support the Nina Turner campaign, them going after me because I don't pledge loyalty to politicians. So there's been a criticism I had because Nina Turner recently came out against the BDS movement. So I actually kind of want to ask you about, because you mentioned BDS in your earlier spill, Gerald Horne. Do you want to speak about BDS and other ways that Palestinians and other colonized people have to resist? Like, what is the best strategy like that people like Palestinians, Afghans, like what is their best mechanism of resisting if not BDS? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, with regard to Nina Turner, you saw what happened in the last election, whereby the woman who won and is now in Congress now, she got a massive infusion of support from the Israel lobby. And Nina Turner was expected to win, and it just blew her out of the water. So this is what I mean about the right wing being so powerful that it seems to force people to toe the line. So now it doesn't surprise me that she's now done a 180 because she figures that if she can neutralize the Israel-Palestine question, then I guess she feels she can move the debate to her strength, which is domestic issues, for example, over the present-day incumbent. I mean, it's a product of living in this right-wing society. And I'm trying to explain, not rationalize or justify. I'm trying to explain. Obviously, the BDS movement is very powerful. The question is, how can it gain traction in light of the fact that you not only have the Abraham Accords, whereby Morocco was co-opted into some sort of de facto recognition of Israel, and now you have the United Arab Emirates moving in a similar direction. Supposedly the Saudis are next in line. And that, of course, is part of the larger play, which is to isolate Iran, which is part of the U.S.-Israel strategy in the long term. The problem there, from the point of view of the imperialist forces, is that if you look at the balance of forces, the correlation of forces globally, you may come to the conclusion that Iran may have the advantage insofar as it has been co-opted to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by Russia and China. And then with India not breaking its ties with Russia, it's also part of the SCO, which means it also has a relationship with Iran. And so the question once again becomes, these two blocks. Now, I'm old enough to remember when it seemed, in light of the Iranian Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution, the Grenadian Revolution in the 1970s, that it seemed as if we were on a roll. But somehow it didn't turn out that way. So without sounding a note of pessimism, let me sound a note of realism, which is that I think that the BDS movement, its best days are ahead of it. I think it appears, and I underline appears, it appears right now that this attempt to marginalize, isolate, if not destroy Iran will not take flight. But as I say, this gray hair, it's not dye. This was all earned honestly.